This is the farmhouse where I grew up, where my father grew up, where my grandfather grew up, where my great-grandfather grew up. The main house was built in 1860. We got electricity in 1943 with the Rural Electrification Act. And now what I am doing is I'm removing the majority of the 1960 updates and reverting the era back to somewhere between 1920 and 1950. I'm going to show you each room in the order that I did them years ago. While I am no more of a carpenter or a designer than any member of my family has ever been, I'm doing it to suit me and my tastes. With the major reconstruction of the floor done, it was now time to level it. It's not going to be perfectly level, but it will be so much better than it was. So I started at the door. That doorway goes into the living room where I had stopped the vinyl floor. I put in some 3/8 plywood to take care of most of the dip, and then I started successive pourings of the leveling compound, as you saw me do in the living room, to take out most of the dip. And then I had to turn my attention to the difference in height between the 1-inch original floorboards and the 3/4 plywood that I put down. So I took a plane and I started nibbling away at the 1/4 inch of wood that stuck up above the plywood, and I just worked my way back into the dip until it was reasonably level. And you can also notice those white strips. That is MH Ready Patch. I covered every single groove between the boards because I did not want that groove to transfer through to the vinyl floor. And then to positively stop any cold air from coming up through the floor, because I know that I missed some of the spots, at Amazon I bought a roll of NASA Tech Radiant Barrier Foil, and as you can see I'm laying it down on the floor. And at the junction of where the floor meets the wall, where you always get leaks, especially in an old house, I ran it a few inches up the wall to prevent any air from slipping under the wall. And with the entire floor covered in that radiant barrier, and I used aluminum tape to seal all the joints, I started putting down the floor. Normally I do the floor at the end, but because we were doing this in the middle of the winter and there was so much cold air coming up through the floor, I decided to lay down that radiant barrier first, and then I didn't want to continue walking on it as I was working on the room. I figured I'd better get the floor down, and I'll just deal with any problems that the construction may cause to the floor afterwards. So, as you can see, we've started to lay the floor. It's the exact same floor that is in the living room. We just continued it through the doorway and on into the bedroom. And we just continued laying the floor across the room. And in the background of this image, you can see the new vinyl replacement window. That had finally arrived. We ordered it in the fall. After a 3-month wait, it showed up in late January, and I'm not putting a window in the middle of winter in northern New York. Now in this image here, you can see where we had started to put up the nickel wall, which is basically the same wall as we put in the living room, except we're using a different paint color. It's called antique. It's what we used out in the mudroom. So we started to put the wall up, and then we realized we probably better get the floor down, like I said earlier, before we damage that radiant barrier. So that's why you see a couple rows of the nickel wall up. And then we continued on with the floor, and you can see that we're nearly done. We've got just 1.5 more strips to do at this point. And with those last strips down, the floor was done, and there will be no more cold air coming up through. And you can see on the left, we've got a stack of pre-painted nickel wall ready to go up. And you'll see that in the next chapter of the Farmhouse Book 10, The Bedroom.